The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, with the midterms behind us, will the president finally be held accountable for his actions? And as over 800 union members get elected to office, what do they want? Plus, Bill Press on the historic wins for women. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The midterm election was widely seen as a referendum on President Trump. Journalist David Corn says that, if nothing else, this election makes it possible for Congress to do what it's supposed to do: hold the executive branch in check. And we say hello to David Corn, who is Mother Jones's Washington bureau chief and an on-air analyst for MSNBC, also the co-author with Michael Isikoff of Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. David Corn, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Great to be with you.
Nice to have you with us as well, and I'm sure you're a very tired person after the elections, but let's get right to it and talk about it. There's still a lot to process from this election, but right now, what are your big takeaways?
Well, my big takeaway is the pretty obvious one, that it was a pretty damn good night for the Democrats. They lost some Senate races that I know are very heartbreaking for them, but gaining control of the House and being able to take up oversight functions that House Republicans and Senate Republicans have eschewed in the last 2 years is really key. They can put a break on what they don't like with the Trump administration, and they can start investigating a host of things. I did a story from Mother Jones as soon as the election results seemed clear, listing dozens of matters that House Democrats have already indicated that they're interested in investigating. And in that way, they can, do what Congress is supposed to do: hold the executive branch in check and hold it accountable. So I think, that will, presents a real threat to Trump, both politically and from a substantive position, because there have been numerous allegations of corruption involving the White House and within some of his appointments at agencies. All that now can be put under the microscope and scrutinized. And we also saw the Democrats pick up 7 or 8 governor seats, particularly in some states that are very key in the presidential elections. Wisconsin, Michigan come to mind. So that, if you're looking ahead to 2020, the Democrats have demonstrated ability to win statewide in states that they would need to win to gain back the presidency. And all this is, I think, in some ways a partial rebuke to Trump. Now, for his part, Trump and the Republicans demonstrated that he remains very, very strong in rural America and that he's able to get those voters to the polls. That's why the Republicans picked up some Senate seats and were able to knock off some vulnerable Democrats in states where Trump had won 2 years ago. So we see a growing divide in this country in which the Democrats really have a strong hold of cities, and they've extended that hold to suburbs and even to some ex-burb areas, while the Republicans are becoming more and more a rural-based party.
Now, obviously, both parties are going to be scouring results for lessons that they can take with them into 2020. So let's start with the Republicans. What do they learn from all of this? Is it just be more like Trump as we move forward?
Well, I think it means in those particular states where Trump is strong to be more like Trump, or if you take Trump on, you separate yourself from the Republican base and you lose voters. I think the Republicans are discovering that it's very hard to be a Republican in the suburbs, particularly those in which there are a lot of voters who are female and female with college degrees. A lot of women with college degrees have turned on the Republican Party largely because they are offended, worried, scared, frightened by Donald Trump. And the party has become so identified with Trump that Republicans in these particular areas are now a threatened species. I mean, if you looked at the chart of Republican House members who were in districts that Hillary Clinton won 2 years ago, they almost all lost. People who voted for Hillary Clinton, came back and more so and said, we cannot abide by the Republican Party anymore. And so Republicans who had seats in these suburban areas for years and years cannot withstand the Trump taint. So in some ways, while the Republicans gain these seats in the Senate, they are becoming more and more a retrenched party tied to Donald Trump and tied to those geographic areas that are still in Trump's pocket.
Did we learn anything we didn't already know about the American electorate and what moves them?
Well, I think we learned a couple of things. If you look at exit polls, it did say that for many Republican voters, immigration was one of the top issues. And so I think that Trump was able to motivate his base with these fear and hate-ridden messages of the last week or two before the campaign, when he portrayed this caravan of migrants as an invasionary force that threatened American security, which is far from the truth. When he had ads out there saying that the Democrats were responsible for a Mexican citizen who had killed 2 cops, I believe in California, who had come to this country illegally and then been deported and came back. And really, he had come into the country and he'd been here for, under Republican administrations when Republicans were in control. So, but I do think we saw that people who are predisposed to Trump are still motivated and still react to his demagoguery. But then we saw that for most Americans, it's a turnoff. His approval ratings were low amongst the voting electorate in this midterms. His disapproval was very high. People who went to the polls said they were concerned about the rise of hate crimes and the increase in white nationalism, all these things that Trump has sort of winked at and played footsie with. So he is really just a base politician. Now that works, that's a pun. I guess I can mean it that way. But what I meant was he has a strong appeal to the Republican base, and that appeal doesn't get much beyond that, which makes it, which if you're a Republican, you'd have to worry about what that means in the coming presidential election, and also what it means if you have a president at the top of the ticket who is a turnoff for most voters, who find his politics to be divisive and who blame him for a lot of the hate in American politics at the moment. So we've seen the electorate again divide between a very strong minority that's with him, a minority of voters, and a larger group that is increasingly alienated from the president.
And David, of course, American politics, it is probably the most divisive in our history at this point. Will a bipartisan Congress be able to move some inroads in closing that divide?
Well, people say it's the most divisive in our history. We did have this thing called the Civil War in the 1860s. I don't mean to be glib here, but we were very much a divided country along some fundamental principles in the 1850s, and we as a country could not solve it peacefully, and 7 million Americans died as a result. I mean, it's quite stunning to think about that. And they died, and nevertheless, slavery ended and the country moved ahead with a lot of difficulty, but it happened. And so we do see a very, very stark divide now. And we've seen politicians in Washington, and I think more so on the Republican side, be incredibly partisan. You look at what happened with the Merrick Garland Supreme Court nomination that Mitch McConnell refused to bring up for a vote, and defying, decades, if not the entirety of American history, the traditions there. So, can they move ahead now? I mean, you're going to have a more Republican Senate than you had in the past, which will be, I think, less inclined to be bipartisan. You have a Democratic House that is going to be committed to doing strong oversight of Trump, which he is going to obviously buckle at. He's already threatened on the first day after the election, that if you come after me with investigations, I'll get the Senate to come after you. I mean, a tremendous abuse of power that we barely bat an eye at, for a president to say he will get the Senate to mount politically motivated investigations to serve his political ends. But so even though he says he wants to work with the Democrats, that is really not a good start. And we still have the Republican Party controlled by the conservative wing, and it's hard to see how anything passed by the Democrats in the House, that Trump agrees to, even if there's a compromise, can get, Republican support in the Senate, at least enough, support to bring it up for a vote. So I think it's very tough. And as we know, even though Trump says he's a straight deal maker, that's really a myth. It's a self-delusion. Getting anything out of a divided Congress is going to be incredibly difficult, particularly for a man who seems to run largely on spite and revenge, and who just can't pass up a chance to exploit hatred, fear, bigotry, and all those other terrible things. So, we had Barack Obama trying to work with Republicans in Congress, and that was incredibly difficult. And you had him and Joe Biden, who was an expert in these sort of things. They got some deals done, but it took a lot of work and a lot of finesse. Donald Trump is not known for working hard or for showing much finesse.
In a piece in Mother Jones leading into this election, you said it is about one very important thing: accountability. And immediately after the election, and at the request of President Trump, Attorney General Jeff Sessions resigns. What does this say about the return of accountability to government?
Well, that's a really good question. All through the last year or so, Donald Trump has said repeatedly that he was angry with Jeff Sessions, recused himself and didn't kill the Mueller investigation and didn't protect him, Trump. So it seems as if he believes it's the job of the AG, the Attorney General, to protect the president. That's really not how our government's supposed to work. It is undoubtedly how a narcissist would view the situation. And now we have not just the Mueller investigation proceeding, you have U.S. attorneys in New York and elsewhere examining what's happening with, or what was done by Michael Cohen, the president's former personal attorney, who's already pled guilty to a crime that he said Trump was a party to. So there's an investigation along those lines that's beyond the Mueller investigation that could target Trump. We've seen questions raised about the Trump Foundation that may be under investigation. And you have all these possible investigations coming out of the House that may involve getting documents and information from the Justice Department. And there may be referrals to the Justice Department from House Democrats who believe Trump administration figures and members of Trump's family have lied to congressional investigators, which of course is a crime. So there's a lot going on, that could actually target Trump, and here he is looking for an AG who will protect him.
And Trump threatened to retaliate with a warlike posture should the new Democratic House majority use its subpoena power to launch investigations into his administration. What does that even mean?
With Trump, a lot of talk is just talk. I mean, he said that he'll go after the House Democrats for leaking classified information. I mean, he's been tweeting for years that, the real criminals are Hillary Clinton and a Russian connection that he doesn't really specify. And it's Democrats for all sorts of abuses. I don't know. He'll just, this is for Fox News audience, for his base, but he'll find something. And the question is whether he will, whether anything he tries to do will actually be legal.
Before we let you go, from a political strategy point of view, do Democrats need to move slowly before taking any action, if only to appear judicious? I mean, can being aggressive actually backfire on them?
I think they need to be deliberative, to make sure that they're proceeding with good investigations, not just throw, a blizzard of subpoenas at Trump without a strong foundation. They need to explain why they're looking at what they're looking at. So they need to look mature, responsible, like grown-ups. Even then, they'll get a lot of crap from Trump and from his base and from Rush Limbaugh and Fox News, and that's okay. They're going to accuse these people of being traitors to the American cause and come up with all sorts of over-the-top rhetoric. But for everybody else, they just need to look like they know what they're doing and they're proceeding with good reason.
Mother Jones Washington Bureau Chief and honor analyst for MSNBC, David Corn, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, we appreciate your time with us as always. Get a little sleep, and we look forward to talking again with you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how 2 million knocks on the door paid off for American workers. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In June, our immigrant-bashing president ordered an end to his own warped policy of forcibly tearing terrified migrant children from the arms of their asylum-seeking parents. Trump declared, "I didn't like the sight or the feeling of families being separated." Yeah, bad optic, as PR consultants call scenes of such thuggishness. So he and we no longer have to witness nightly TV coverage of shrieking toddlers being taken from their parents and hauled off to federal warehouses. But wait, out of sight doesn't mean the depravity has ended. Some 500 of the 2,900 children who were snatched last spring are still in government custody, scared that they'll never see their parents again and traumatized by the uncertainty of what'll happen to them. Worse, more refugee children are being incarcerated every day as they seek asylum from the horrors of rapacious gang wars and abject poverty in their Central American homelands. More than 12,000 migrant children are now out of sight and out of mind in our government's warehouses, military bases, and sprawling tent cities. And Trump is requesting money to lock up another 20,000 children. All this trauma and cost is the result of the Trumpeteers' inhumane and failed zero-tolerance policy of jailing children, even babies, in hopes of scaring other refugees from seeking asylum in our land of opportunity. They created this humanitarian crisis, and rather than ending it by rushing in hundreds of lawyers and judges to process the asylum requests, Trump and his rabidly anti-immigrant ideologues are taxing us by building more jails for refugees, while also openly violating the law that says immigrant children cannot be locked up for more than 20 days. This is Jim Hightower saying, for more about Trump's sick and sickening policy, contact Kids in Need of Defense at supportkind.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. A record number of labor-endorsed union members claimed victory in the midterms. Union organizer Chris Garlock tells us how they did it and what it may mean. And we say hello to Chris Garlock, who is the coordinator of Union Cities at the Metro D.C. AFL-CIO. He's also managing editor of the Union City blog and host of Union City Radio. Chris Garlock, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks.
You're quite welcome and nice to have you with us. The midterm election, Chris, has been called a lot of waves, from pink wave to rainbow wave to a blue wave with a red undertow. Could it also be called a labor wave?
That's a lot of waves, isn't it? But absolutely. Yeah, definitely a big labor wave. In fact, it's interesting. Ever since the election, we knew that a record number of labor folks were running this year. Of course, a lot of folks knew that a lot of women were running this year. Interestingly, a lot of crossover in both of those waves. But the latest count that I have, and this has been a bit of a moving target, but it's over 800 union members that won election from U.S. Senate right on down to state capitals. So pretty big year for us.
Wow, that is very impressive. And what were some of the biggest wins for labor unions at the congressional level?
Well, I'll just hit a couple. I mean, with that many, obviously, unless your podcast is a lot longer than I think. We're not going to be exhaustive here, but I'll hit the highlights. One of the biggest was Jackie Rosen in Nevada. Obviously, she's a member of Unite Here. That was a pretty cool win. It was powered by the Culinary Workers Local 226 in Las Vegas. 50,000 members. It's a really big local, very active local. It's actually the largest local in Unite Here. And another one was the local's former director of his training institute, a guy named Stephen Horsford, who happens to be African-American, won his old U.S. House seat back as well. So kind of a double win there. A couple of others I'll just mention. Representative Johanna Hayes in Connecticut. She's a union member. Ilhan Omar out of AFSCME in Minnesota. Also have to shout out to my old friend Andy Levin, former AFL-CIO staffer, succeeded his dad, Sander Levin, in Detroit area House District. So those are just a couple of highlights. I want to just mention also, I'm here in the Metro D.C. area, obviously, and we had a couple of folks that we sent to the State Assembly, UFCW Local 1994, Gabe Acevero, just a wonderful, exciting young guy and union staffer. I know him well, and was real excited to see him running and winning. And then also Harry Bhandari, who's from the Baltimore Teachers Union. So they're going to be both going to the Maryland Assembly. By the way, a lot of those folks, you may have noticed, are from the teachers. And so this kind of, we're talking about waves. It's a little bit of a second wave here of teacher activism that we're seeing.
Which is really nice to see. I guess you could even say that was long overdue. Chris, what about governors?
Oh, I tell you, governors, we've been having a lot of trouble, as you know well, with the governorships. And it's so important, obviously, especially with redistricting coming up, and seeing all of the issues that have arisen out of all the gerrymandering for the election. So the one that we got to start with is we finally got rid of Scott Walker. We obviously, in the labor movement, he got elected, didn't say anything about attacking labor, and the first thing he did when he got in was to go after labor. We tried to recall him. That didn't work out so well, but we finally got rid of Scott Walker. So we're happy about that. Now we're going to have to be setting about repairing the damage that he's done. Another big anti-union governor, Bruce Rauner, in Illinois, we also sent him packing. So we're happy about that as well. Now, on the pro side, we got Gretchen Whitmer from AFT elected in Michigan, Tim Waltz from Education Minnesota, obviously in Minnesota. And then we also elected some pro-labor governors in Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Colorado, Maine, and Kansas, for those keeping score out there. So it's a pretty big day for both the Democrats and for labor. So nice to see that.
Absolutely. We're speaking with Chris Garlock, the coordinator of Union Cities at the Metro D.C. AFL-CIO. Chris, also managing editor of the Union City blog and host of Union City Radio. Chris, tell us a bit about the effort to get out the labor vote.
Well, as Democrats know well, that's always been our strongest suit, right? I mean, here's the thing about labor, right? We organize 24/7. We're always organizing. That's what we do. So, doing get out the vote sort of comes naturally to us. And in fact, both parties have copied a lot of our tactics. But I think we're still the best at it, if I can say that. We have a really good infrastructure. Here's just some numbers for you. We knocked on more than 2.3 million doors. That's a lot of doors. Distributed 5 million flyers at more than 4,600 work sites. And this is sort of an interesting, sign of the times. Of course, we sent out a lot of direct mail, some 12 million pieces, but we also sent more than 250,000 texts. And that's not even counting all the social media. I'm sure there's some way to measure that, but there was, I'm sure you saw it. I certainly saw it. Facebook, Twitter, it was probably on Instagram,
Right.
Every platform out there. I mean, I mentioned that just because there was a lot of concern rightfully leading up, to the election about what was going to be happening on social media. But I know that, there was just a ton in the labor movement. I think, like a lot of folks, I'm actually kind of glad to be moving on from that at this point.
Right. Well, and it sounds to me like it was the good old-fashioned, knocking on doors as well as social media. So taking advantage of what we've always known to be successful to get the vote out there, but then also taking advantage of, where we are in today's society.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that, again, these are structures that the labor movement already has in place by virtue of what we do, right? I mean, when you organize, we talk about this all the time. Certainly, we've been using social media and, any new technologies in organizing. But you're absolutely right. The bottom line is there's nothing better than one-on-one. And in fact, on one of my podcasts this week, we talked to somebody from Working America that was doing, that kind of one-on-one work across the country. It's slow, it's painstaking, it's a lot of door knocking, it's a lot of conversations. But it really is how you can move people in the end. I personally don't think that Facebook moves people. I think that Facebook reinforces. I think it's helpful. I mean, I think social media in general, but I think it's really those kind of conversations at the door or at the workplace that really do move voters in the end.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. And in fact, I had a couple of instances where people came around to my door, knocked on the door, and it was nice to know them. One of them I voted for, one of them I didn't. But it was still, the face-to-face meant a lot. So now, given the strength of the economy going into this election, what do these results tell you about what workers want to see politicians do to improve their lives?
Yeah, really complicated question, but I'm going to say healthcare. I really, there's so many issues, but and I have to say that here in the labor movement, this is an issue that we've been dealing with for years now. It's been a huge driver at the bargaining table because it doesn't do you any good, to eke out a couple of percent raise and then you get whacked with increased healthcare costs that wind up, your members take this big hit on healthcare costs. So we've been ahead of the curve on that, on fighting that battle. And here's the really interesting thing. I mean, just a few years ago, when you wanted to talk about, universal health care, I mean, you'd get laughed out of the room, honestly. I mean, it was just, maybe in Canada, maybe in Europe, but, that's just not the way we roll in the U.S. It's one of the reasons I think the GOP was able to use Obamacare, as this political cudgel, right?
Absolutely.
In the end, even they, were reduced. It was a little pitiful, to be honest. They had to kind of pretend like, that they were for healthcare, that they hadn't spent the last however many years, opposing it, trying to defund it, the whole 9 yards, and pretend that they were actually for healthcare. And I love the fact that it didn't work. I think the politicians saw right, or the voters saw right through that fairly cynical ploy by the GOP to try and pretend something else. But it's such a kitchen table issue, because it's dollars and cents. The overall thing is that healthcare really is a basic human right. And so I think the fact that we can actually now talk about universal healthcare and have a serious discussion is going to be really big. Now, obviously, that's a long way down the road, but I did see this week that the GOP actually apparently has abandoned their attempts to repeal Obamacare. So maybe we're finally moving in the right direction.
All the years and years. Oh no, repeal and replace, and yet there's no plan. So I mean, it has not made sense from the start. It certainly didn't make sense during this election. Chris, where and how do you expect to see the impact of labor-friendly politicians?
Yeah, that's going to play out in a lot of ways down on the ground, and I think it's going to really vary. I mean, certainly in D.C., we've got a ton of stuff going on the federal level, lots of attacks. We were just dealing with something at the VA, where they're trying to take away this thing called official time, where union reps represent workers on official time. People are being unions are being kicked out of their union offices. I mean, so all kinds of things like that. But I think that the overall thing that we're going to see is that we frankly have been especially since Trump got in, we've been playing defense, right? The employers have been led by the biggest boss. Yeah, I'm talking about Donald Trump, and we've had to play a lot of defense. I think we've done a really good job. I think the Democrats have done a really good job, being effective on defense, being cohesive, having good messages. And I think now we're going to be able to go on the offense, and that's going to be a really good thing. And, I think there's going to be a bunch of different issues that we can look at. Certainly for us, we're thinking, a lot of people want to organize. We need to eliminate roadblocks to organizing. We need to legalize card check, really impose higher fines on labor lawbreakers, stuff like that. A lot of real kind of interesting things. But I'll tell you something that, to me, it might seem like a little thing, but I think it's sort of indicative of where we're going. As I'm sure you know, the key House committee on our issues is what is these days called the Workforce Committee. Now, this used to be the Education and Labor Committee until the GOP took over in '94 during those midterms, right? So they dumped the word labor and they called it the Workforce Committee. And then when the Democrats got back in '06, put the labor back in. And then when the GOP got back and took over the House, they took it back to workforce. So now that the Democrats are back in, I think we're going to put the labor back in the Labor and Education Committee. And, it seems like a little thing and it's semantics, but, as you know, words matter, right? And so if we can actually get labor back in the title of that committee, maybe we can actually start dealing with some labor issues. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Let me ask you this, though. What's the lesson or lessons here for the Democratic Party moving forward?
I got a real simple answer on that one. When Democrats support working people, we've got your back. And when you don't, we're going to look elsewhere. Yeah. Good stuff. Chris Garlock, coordinator of Union Cities at the Metro D.C. AFL-CIO. He's also managing editor of the Union City blog and host of Union City Radio, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Chris, we thank you for your time today and look forward to hearing back from you again soon. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed it. And thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Bob Bland, founder of the Women's March, joins Bill Press now to talk about the women who will change the way our nation is governed.
We're still trying to assess all the results of the midterm elections. One thing for sure, it was a big year for women, women candidates, and women victors on Tuesday, and a whole, if you want to borrow a phrase, caravan of new Democratic women heading to the United States Congress. A lot of people feel that this is just the next outcome or result of the Great Women's March on Washington way back in January 2017, which I proudly took part in. The co-founder of that Women's March, Bob Bland, joins us in studio. So it's good to see you today. Thank you.
Great to see you today.
Congratulations
Thank you.
All your continued success.
Thank you.
Tell us again how the Women's March got started. I love the story.
Yes, so on actually exactly 2 years ago was Election Day for 2016. And what we saw was that things didn't turn out the way that we thought we were. There were women, millions of women and other people across the nation who woke up shocked and confused and dazed and didn't know what to do. And one of them was Teresa Shook in Hawaii, a Hawaiian grandmother and lawyer. And then one of them was me in New York City. I was fresh off of having my Nasty Woman t-shirt go viral and finding this whole community of women that I didn't even know about all across the nation. And so the day after the election, they turned to me and said, "Bob, what are we going to do?"
Yeah. And you said, "We're going to march."
I said, "We're going to march on Washington on Inauguration weekend." And it was incredible, the most viral grassroots phenomena, I think, possibly that we've seen since Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. And it was absolutely amazing to see the numbers rise from just tens of thousands of people saying they were going to hundreds of thousands of people in less than 48 hours. And then to actually have on January 21st, 2017, millions come out in hundreds of events across the nation and the world.
Around the world, yeah.
It gave us... it showed us that women aren't going anywhere, that we will fight for our rights. And I think what we're seeing now with these midterm elections is it was a test of whether that collective power that we saw of feet on the street could translate to political power. And I think undoubtedly we've seen historically, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just so that people understand, the Women's March isn't over, right? Or didn't stop. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
Yeah,
many different
we
iterations
never
of
stopped.
it. But yeah,
honestly, I thought I was going to get a day off, but immediately afterwards, the very next weekend, we were out with so many others for the Muslim ban protests at the airports across the nation, and women never stopped mobilizing after January 21st.
So there still is an organization, womensmarch.com. Is that your?
Yes. So we have a social, we also have a .org. So we have a social and political advocacy organization called Women's March that was born out of the women who organized the marches across the nation saying, oh, well, we don't want to stop now. We have so much more to do. And so many people asking us after January 21st, what can we do now? So we started with 10 actions during the first 100 days of Trump's administration. And from there, we've just been doing what we do best, mass mobilizing women, educating them on how to organize locally. And then this year with Power to the Polls, which was launched on January 21st, 2018, last year, in this what we consider to be the state of the woman, which is Nevada, where we just saw what we foretold on January 21st last year, which is that women won in Nevada. Nevada got its first woman governor. It has a women senator. It's one of the only states that is actually on the cusp of having not only a plurality of women in its state legislature, but a majority of women in its state legislature. And so that's why we launched Power to the Polls there. And I think what we've seen over the last year is thousands of women running for office, winning in state legislatures, in court races, in supervisors, school boards all across the nation. But it's not just municipal. We're seeing also with the federal races what people told us was impossible, the idea of 100 women taking their seats in Congress this session.
Which will happen this session.
Which is happening. Yeah, yes. People told us it couldn't even be done by 2020, and we did it in one election cycle.
Yeah, I know. It's just amazing, the energy. And and also, we talk about the quantity, right? 100, that's so impressive. I think sometimes that overshadows the quality of the people who won, too. I mean, when you look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? 29 years old, the youngest member of Congress, right?
Yeah, we're welcoming our first 2 Muslim women to Congress. Yeah. We're welcoming 2 Native American women. Their stories are incredible. I mean, the one woman, I forget her name now, but who's a Somali immigrant. Yes. Ilhan Omar.
Who grew up in a refugee camp.
Yes.
Comes to the United States and now a member of the United States Congress. Talk about the American dream, right?
The face of our leadership needs to reflect the face of the nation, and we're seeing the first women's wave of that this year.
Right. So the first 2 Muslim American women, the first 2 Native American women, right? I mentioned Ocasio-Cortez. There are Alana... her last name, from Massachusetts.
Presley.
Ayanna Presley, who is the first first woman of color to represent the liberal state of Massachusetts. It seems, took a long time, but
well, it's because structural white supremacy still exists in all of its forms in America, and so what we're also seeing with the Women's March is it pushed the conversation forward on not just the idea of women taking the lead, but also women of color taking their seat at the table and really reflecting their communities. And what we're seeing across the nation is women of color are leading campaigns. Women of color are organizing on the ground. They're fighting against voter suppression, which is such a big theme of this cycle. And then they're winning their elections in numbers that are too big to ignore.
Right. I was just reflecting also, Arizona will have a female senator. Hopefully it's going to be Kyrsten Sinema. She's ahead this morning by 9,600 votes, if you didn't catch up with that news yet. But definitely Arizona, for the first time, will have a woman representing them in the United States Senate. Right? And
isn't it interesting how every single vote finally counts this cycle in a way that I know I've never seen in my life?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of these races so close, with now a recount in Florida on the Senate race, a recount in Florida on the governor's race as well, and a still possible runoff in Georgia, where, talk about again, emergence of women as a power force. Stacey Abrams, who still has a chance to become the first African-American governor of the state, female governor of the state of Georgia.
And I got to be honest, I don't think without Stacey Abrams...
country, actually.
Yeah, in the country. But without Stacey Abrams standing up there on Tuesday night and saying, oh, this race is not over, we are going to count every single vote. If she hadn't taken that sort of leadership, I don't think we would be seeing the recounts and the amount of tenacity around getting every single provisional ballot in that we're seeing across all of these other races in the nation. So that's another example of when young, Black, unapologetic women lead, then we all win.
Right. Do you have any idea the number of female candidates this year across the board?
Yes, well, it depends on what level. So there was over 450 candidates at the federal level in various races. There was 4,000 at the municipal and state level. At the state level.
Yeah.
And then at the municipal level, who knows, tens of thousands probably. And one startling statistic from last year was that Emily's List, which is an organization that helps women to run for office
Great
and teaches them how to do it.
Been around for a long time.
Yeah,
Good
that's
friends
right.
of the show. Yeah.
Oh, they're fantastic. And they had, after the original Women's March on Washington, in that first year alone, it went from 400 women signing up to get trained to run for office to over 40,000 women signing up to get trained to run for office, and that's not even including in 2018. So I think the other thing we're seeing right now is this is just the first in the women's wave. This is just the first wave. What we're going to see is that this is an intergenerational phenomena. So in 2020 and 2024, this is going to continue to ripple. And also all of these candidates who either ran, whether they lost and they're going to run again in 2020, or whether they won in a state position, they're going to be seeking federal positions in the future. So I think we can't underestimate the change that we've seen from 2016 to 2018.
Oh, yeah. No, this is the future of the country and the future of the Democratic Party.
That's right.
Is there a similar movement you see in the Republican Party in terms of recruiting women? I mean, obviously, sadly, I believe Marsha Blackburn is going to be representing Tennessee, the first female senator from Tennessee. To a certain extent, that's progress, I guess, but I hate the fact that it happens to be her. But the Republican Party, which has traditionally been the party of older white men, I mean, do they see the need to recruit particularly women and people of color?
Well, I certainly...
You see any sign of it?
I certainly see that happening. I think that it's almost impossible for people to see the way they've doubled down on anti-Semitism, on anti-immigration sentiment, on anti-blackness, and then also on voter suppression in this cycle, and really pushing up against the rule of law in so many different ways, let alone the travesty we saw with Kavanaugh during October. I was there protesting on the ground for 34 days during the Kavanaugh hearings. And it was unequivocal that the Republican Party stood as the party of men, not the party of survivors. So I think what we're seeing is, while there's not a mass exodus of white women from the Republican Party, there has been, particularly in college-educated women, a reduction by 10% just in this cycle. And then when you look at young people, because this was also the year of the young voter, we had higher turnout thanks to the organizing after Parkland with the March for Our Lives. Youth Empower, which is our group, was also a part of that by organizing the March 14th student walkouts, where 1.5 million students walked out across the nation. And that really started to spark this interest in voting with young people like nothing I've ever seen in my lifetime. And they are unequivocally going towards the Democratic Party. So I think what you're going to see is Republicans, as long as they continue on this desperate path towards white nationalism, you are going to continue to see them losing with women, losing with young people. And then, of course, it's my job as a white woman to get us to start seeing the way that we internalize racism and to dismantle that. And that's just something that the country, everybody in this country, it's undeniable after you see the way Native Americans were suppressed at the ballot box. Black people were suppressed at the ballot box.
In Georgia and other states.
Texas, Latinx and immigrant people are being disenfranchised. That this is racist, and the Democratic Party has to be the party that changes that.
Yeah. And, there's no doubt about it that with these new members of Congress, these women, particularly these younger women, women of color, the direction of the United States Congress, not just the makeup, but the whole direction of the United States Congress is going to change, reflect different priorities, and I think get some things done. It's very, very exciting. So what's next? Right? It's been 2 whole days. Do you have another whole plan for where we go from the midterms?
So once again, I thought I'd get a day off. And again, we do not, because we have been still tirelessly working with our partners like Care in Action in Georgia and Second Chances and Dream Defenders in Florida, getting every single one of these provisional ballots in for the Andrew Gillum race. I can't overstate the importance of the passing of Amendment 4 in Florida, which re-enfranchised 1.5 million voters. At this point in Florida until Tuesday, 40% of Black men in Florida did not have the vote.
I know. That's huge. And 10% of the entire state's voting age population could not vote.
That's right.
Because they had a felon in their past. So
we're still working on that, but next up,
to finish that, there's no doubt in my mind, and I think there's just no doubt, period, that if felons were able to vote, right, Andrew Gillum would definitely be the governor of Florida, and Bill Nelson would be the senator.
Flat
out.
Black voters are the backbone of the Democratic Party. They're the only group of people that are regularly voting 96, 97% for Democrats, and that can't be overstated. So Democrats have a lot to reflect on. In the meantime, Women's March is moving towards our 3rd anniversary. So on January 19th, 2019, we will be back here in Washington, D.C. for the Women's Wave.
Oh, really? Oh, yes. Cool. What is it, January 19th?
January 19th, 2019. We will be offering trainings for thousands of people both the day before and the day afterwards for people who want to learn more about organizing and specifically about nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action, which historically has been a group of tactics that the civil rights movement, most famously, of course, with Dr. King and Representative John Lewis and many, but you've seen it a lot even during this cycle where nonviolence, which are the principles we organize under, and direct action are a way for people to connect directly with people in their communities. And it's really all about organizing locally. So we want people to come to Washington. We want them to participate in the march, to participate in the rally, in these trainings, and then take all of that knowledge, all of that energy, the feeling that you got on January 21st, 2017, if you participated in any of the marches. We want you to take that back home and then continue to be galvanized for the fight ahead, because this is really just halftime. Like midterms is midterms. This is just the halftime in a fight that is not over. And we need to keep our strength for 2020, take care of each other, and make sure women all across the country know that we're not going anywhere.
I'm just looking here. It's the 3rd Saturday in January.
That's right.
Yeah. Saturday, January 19. So mark it on your calendar right now. And will there be sister marches around the country?
Yes. We, I believe today is the day that we'll be releasing the initial map of sister marches. We have chapters all across the nation, and then also micro groups called huddles that have been organizing continuously ever since the original Women's March on Washington. And many of them will be hosting sister marches across the nation. So even if you can't get to Washington, there is guaranteed to be a march in your area. Something that you should know is that last year, 2018, we actually had more people march that weekend. We went up from 3.5 million in the United States to over 4 million in the United States who marched that weekend, even though it was a much more dispersed grassroots effort than the year before. So I think this resistance to hate, this rise of the woman is just getting started. And we look forward to seeing you all on January 19th, 2019.
All right. Absolutely. January 19, mark it down. And again, the Women's March isn't over. It didn't stop on that one day. It has continued on. And women now are running, have been running for office. More and more will be doing and winning and making their way. It's going to be a big day when they're all sworn in here on the. I know you'll be in town for that.
I can't wait.
But at women's, so people want to find out more about the best place to go is womensmarch.com, right?
That's right.
All right, great. It's great what you're doing. The energy is just really, you can just feel it in the air. And the results, you can't deny the results, right? I mean,
it's been effective.
Absolutely.
And honestly, I'm honored to even get to contribute to that because it's beyond anything I could have imagined for my generation.
And little did you realize what you guys were starting with those couple of tweets.
We had no idea.
In November of 2016, right?
That's
right. And look where you are today in such a short period of time.
That's right. Well, that's the power. When women collectively come together in numbers too big to ignore, this is the effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, congratulations. Bob Bland, co-founder of the Women's March, and you, again, can sign up right now for January 19. Go to womensmarch.com and find out all the great things that they're doing. Thanks so much, Bob, for coming in.
Thank you.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Korn, Chris Garlock, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.